Hi everyone, this is Savor at Home number 69, and tonight I am not just tasting one whiskey, I'm not just tasting two whiskeys, I am tasting three whiskeys. So this weekend we did a neat blind tasting to celebrate Galentine's Day, where we tasted three different whiskeys from Penderyn Distillery, which is a Welsh distillery. So these are three different Welsh single malts produced by Penderyn. So what I'm going to taste in this order is the Penderyn Madeira Finish, the Penderyn Peated, and the Penderyn Sherrywood. So to my knowledge, all three of these whiskeys are the same base single malt that then is finished in three different types of barrels. So the Madeira barrel, the Peated barrel, and the Oloroso sherry barrel. And they're all bottled at the same ABV. All three of them are 46% ABV. So this provides for a pretty unique comparison between the barrel finishings that they use. Penderyn's a very cool distillery. They were founded in 2004, so they're also relatively new. Penderyn is known for their unique still that they use. It's called a Faraday still, and a lot of micro distilleries or craft distilleries in the US are using essentially the similar stills. We'd call them hybrid stills, but they are a pot still with a column on top. And Penderyn has a column on top and then a column alongside of it to increase rectification. And in one single distillation, Penderyn is able to produce a spirit that's 92% ABV. So it is a very pure spirit. And to give you a little bit of a reference, vodka has to be distilled to 95% ABV or above. So 92% is really close. So a lot of those impurities from the wash, from the fermentation, are kind of removed out, or we could say that they're more selective about the flavors that they allow through. So it's producing a much lighter, more delicate spirit. And they did just install a couple of traditional, like Scottish style pot stills at their distillery so they can start producing other expressions as well. To kind of be able to blend in maybe some of those heavier malts that they're producing out of the Scottish style stills with the lighter malts produced by the Faraday still. Also, something that's pretty cool about Penderyn Distillery is that their distillation team is entirely female run. So whoop whoop. So shout out to the ladies over at Penderyn Distillery who are producing great spirits and doing a great job and trailblazing the way for other females to get into the industry. I'm going to taste these in the same order that the participants tasted them in. Of course, I'm wearing a sweatshirt that's not going to help with any color differentiation here. But the middle one, the Peated, is the very lightest out of the three of them. So if I'm comparing the colors between the three of them, the Peated is very, very light. And the first one I'm going to start with is the Madeira. Now, the Madeira looks like there's a touch of like a rust color added in. So definitely coming from the Madeira. So immediately on the nose, I'm getting lots of sweetness, lots of toffee, a ton of butterscotch, but it has some like soapy floral aspects to it. And it's like an orange blossom. There's also cinnamon and nutmeg in here. There's also some notes of like wet wood. So the mouthfeel does build up pretty nicely in viscosity. It's not super, super creamy or anything like that, but it is building up in viscosity. There's a touch of heat in here that, you know, I is not necessarily desirable for something that's 46% ABV. But as far as flavors go, there's a lot of sweetness that's balanced with some bitter aspects as well. So I'm getting some sweet orange and like candied lemon peel. There's some nuttiness, specifically like macadamia nuts. There's a little bit of like lemongrass as well coming in. A little bit of bitterness, so a little bit of like espresso. It's got some roasty flavors as well, so maybe those macadamia nuts are toasted. But the finish is a little bit dry and a little bit astringent. So yeah, that is the Madeira. Time to move on to the second one, which is the peated cask. So it does say peated on the bottle. Again, look at how light that is, like nearly clear. It does say peated on the bottle, but they are not peating the barley. They're using casks from Islay to then finish this whiskey in. So right off the bat, you're getting that smokiness, but it almost comes across as like incense. Like you walk into a cute little like bohemian shop, the classic like incense that they have burning. Some soapiness in here too. There's some beef jerky as well, but just a little bit in the background, some wet dirt. And then there's just like more of that smokiness, almost like you burn sage in your apartment. It's kind of like someone's standing really far away and I'm like, hey, is that person drinking Kalila? So there's less heat on this one than the Madeira Finish. It still has a little bit of, you know, that viscosity built up in the mouthfeel, which is great. This one's very interesting because if I took a longer sip, let the sip sit in my mouth for a while, I was actually getting way less flavors than if I took a quicker sip, which is the first time this has kind of really happened to me. Usually if I'm not getting a whole lot of flavors, I'll let it sit longer. So when I was taking a long sip, the flavors that I was mostly getting was almost just like you put out a cigarette in some water and then gave me that water. When I took the shorter sip, I was getting more notes of citrus and some spice like nutmeg. It had lingering notes of like an earthy, like wild honey. Time to move on to the final one, the Sherrywood. The color on this one is a little bit darker than the peated. It's almost like someone added in a drop of caramel. Still very light, but a little bit more of like that caramel color to it. So there's a lot of fruit in here, but it's like funky fruit. So I'm getting some dried fruit, some prunes and some figs. But there's almost like, you know, a rotten banana smell in here. So if you're a fan of Jamaican rums, you might like this. It smells like funky, sweet feet. I don't know how else to describe it. I mean, it's got that, yeah, like a sherry funk to it. No heat at all. It was a little thin, so it wasn't really building in that viscosity. But the flavors were very medicinal. It was like cough drops, like the red ones. And I don't know if those are like cherry flavor or just generic red flavor. So a little bit of like an artificial cherry thing, almost like cherry Coke. But yeah, very much like cough drops. But then the finish had a little bit more of like a milk chocolate variety pack. Yeah, so like milk chocolate covered caramels and maybe milk chocolate covered like soaked cherries as well. But that was just lingering very, very subtly in the background. Ultimately, I can find things that I really enjoy about all three of these, and I can find things that are a little bit off for me. The Madeira Finish is, you know, very well balanced, I'd say. There's that sweet and that bitter. It's really light as well. The peated cask has that smokiness. I'm a sucker for smoke. I wish there was more complexity across the board, I suppose. And then the third one, the Sherrywood, I think is interesting. I'd have to definitely be in the mood in order to enjoy those medicinal, funky flavors for sure. One question that came up during the tasting this weekend is, why does the peated cask actually taste so peaty? And I think the reason that all three of these taste very different is because of the fact that they are distilled to such a high proof. So that kind of lends all the flavors to come from the barrels that are being used. So if you're using primarily ex-bourbon barrels for the initial maturation and then finishing in Madeira and Peated and Oloroso sherry barrels, those whiskeys will pull a lot of flavor from the liquids that were previously in said barrels. So I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about this, is that you can have the same spirit, but because it is such a high proof coming off the still, there's not a lot of nuances, so not a lot of characteristics coming from the base spirit. And this is just my speculation. Another question that came up is, how long do distilleries typically finish their whiskeys in different casks? And that is so varied across the board and depends on each distillery. That finishing period can range anywhere from a couple of weeks up to a few years and everywhere in between. So it just depends on each distillery. Typically, the shorter the amount of time, the more you are just pulling the flavors from the liquid that was previously in the barrel. The longer the amount of time, the more you allow those flavors to interact with the compounds that are in the whiskey, using the barrel as essentially a catalyst to promote some reactions. So there's a little bit more that can happen over longer periods of time. But I'm really excited to see what Penderyn puts out as the years go on, because I think what they're making now is interesting stuff. If any of these seem like they would be interesting to you, you should try and pick them up. But hopefully, we'll have some more expressions from Penderyn in the future.